Thank you everyone for coming another week to RfRx. My name is Amaya Perez. I'm the online programming director of RfR, and I'm here with Madeline, who is going to be my co-host today. And she's also a part-time social hangout host in RfR too. So Madeline, thank you so much for coming and welcome to today's session.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Excited for today's talk.
Amazing. So let me just pull up the first poll first.
I see the poll and I can read the questions for anyone that's not following along on the screen. We have 4 questions here, multiple answers I'll read through. What version of Christianity have you belonged to? You have Catholicism, Evangelical, Anglican, Lutheran, Eastern Orthodox, or not applicable. Do you often find yourself considering the importance of what the Catholic Pope has to say, regardless of your belief system? Yes, no, or yes, and I find it annoying, I get caught up in it. When you think of the Bible, what version do you consider it being? And this is what I have to admit, I also have questions about. The first one is the NIV, the New International Version, the King James Version, or this one I didn't know myself, the New American Standard Version. Oh, actually, that's not or. The last one is the Klingon version, which, yes, it kind of actually exists, and we can share the link. So the last question is, what doctrine still troubles you the most about Christianity? The Trinity, the original sin, the virgin birth, or the role of women in the church? I also wanted to give a quick shout out to the atheist community of Discord, the ACD. They're kindly sharing our stream, usually, always, I should say. And they're a great community to go and check out. We'll also add their link here in the chat box. And Amaya, do you want to tell us a little bit about RfR?
Yeah, for sure. So for those of you who are new, RfRx is basically a series of online weekly sessions where we bring in different guests to discuss about topics that have to do with religion or living religion. This is a way of providing good advice and coping skills to anyone who needs them right now. And if you want to see any of our previous RfRx sessions, you can go to our YouTube channel, and that is youtube.com/recoveringfromreligion. And I also highly encourage you to subscribe because we are trying to get the numbers up on the channel. So if at any point you miss any of our previous RfRx sessions, they will be up there. And then the other thing before we continue is that if you have any sort of questions, any feedbacks, any ideas for topics, for speakers, literally anything you want to ask, we do have an email for the RfRx project, and that is rfrx@recoveringfromreligion.org. So yeah, if you have any sort of suggestions or anything, we would love to hear what you guys think about it. So that's the first bit. But then RfRx is obviously part of a wider organization called Recovering from Religion. And Recovering from Religion does so many different things. So we are just going to give a brief introduction to what it is that we do in RfR in general. So the first thing to say is what's RfR's mission statement. So the mission statement of RfR is that we offer hope, healing, and support to those who are struggling with issues of religion and non-belief. So the first thing that we offer is healing. And the way that we offer healing is via our helpline. So you can access our helpline either via online chat or telephone call, and there are trained agents who will listen to you with an empathetic ear and no judgment or criticism to any issue that you may have which is related to religion. This is completely confidential, available 24/7, and safe resource to use. So I do highly encourage you contact one of our helpline agents because they are wonderfully trained, and I'm sure they will help you. This is the kind of help that you need. Then the other section of healing is the resource page. So we have collected a very large number of resources and put them in a website. And these resources include everything from podcasts, articles, books, videos, anything you can imagine, you will find it there. We have also divided it in different topics. So if you are someone who has left a specific religion, then you will find specific resources for you. Or if you're struggling on a specific topic, such as fear of hell, you will find specific resources for those topics. So it's just a really good way of accessing good information and just making sure that you're getting the best that is available out there. So again, if that's the kind of format that you prefer, I do highly encourage you join well, not join, obviously, just visit the resource page. And Madeline, you want to explain Hope and Support, please?
Yes, of course. So hope we offer by sharing and listening to personal stories. We are all in this together, and we have a blog and the podcast where you can listen to these stories that have been shared. There's wonderful communications here for you to browse through. We'll put that link in the chat box. And support we offer two ways, via peer support groups, which are face-to-face in-person meetings usually. Right now they're all online. We have over 50 groups all around the world, and we're always looking to form even more. They can be found on our meetup site. The next way that we offer support is via the Secular Therapy Project, which is a tool to help you connect with a licensed secular mental health care provider. And these providers are carefully screened for the criteria of being appropriately licensed in their state or country, maintaining a secular practice so they won't proselytize to you, and also the exclusive use of evidence-based treatments. I'll link that website here in the chat soon. Amaya, do you want to talk a little bit more about RfR?
Yes, so the only two things to mention now is the online community. And the online community is basically an online platform where you can chat with and meet people that share similar backgrounds as you. We have divided this platform in different groups, so you can join, you know, whatever group you feel like would suit you the best. So we have a group for LGBTQ+ community, we have a group for only women, for Australians, we have a group for street epistemology to practice if this is something that you're, so excuse me, something that you're interested in. So yeah, if you feel like this is something that you could benefit from, just meeting people that share similar backgrounds as you, all you have to do is contact one of our helpline agents, and they will let you know if you meet the criteria to join one of these groups, and then they will guide you through the steps that you need to follow in order to join one of these groups. And then the last thing before we jump to the RfRx session is volunteering. So for those of you who don't know, Recovering from Religion is exclusively run by volunteers, and we're always looking for new talents and new people. So if you feel like, I don't know, you have more free time now that we are all in lockdown still, or if you feel like this is something that you do truly believe in, or if you want to develop new skills, I do highly encourage you joining us as a volunteer. We have so many different roles available. You could be a helpline agent, you could be a support group leader, you could be, I think it's a website developer. I don't know the exact term, I forgot from last week, but you know, if you're not into the emotional side of it, you can also provide some inputs in the more technical side. So I can guarantee you, if you're interested and you know you're passionate about it, we will find a place for you. So yeah, I do highly encourage you to join us as a volunteer because it's an amazing journey. Today we're going to speak about Christianity. It's going to be a religion series, and we're going to have no other than David, who has been here before. He had a talk about identity, and it was really, really interesting. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome him back to another RfRx session. So David, thank you so much for joining us once again. And yeah, just welcome.
Thank you, Amaya. Hi, everybody. I'm already seeing the chat room is exploding all over the place, so that's awesome. Real quick from the beginning, so my name is David Teachout. In the West Coast, and really this for me is as much of a dialogue as possible. So we definitely have a bunch of questions as a kind of outline. But really anything that comes up, if it fits in, great. If it doesn't, then yes, there is the Q&A afterwards, and I will be taking time to join for a while. We'll see how long, but I'll be there for a while afterwards, since I just love talking about this stuff. So real quick, as far as bona fides, I guess, are concerned. So I grew up in Michigan, and was originally going to be a minister for evangelical Christianity. Grew up Baptist, went Southern Baptist, for those that know about such things. and then went to college at Grace Bible College, what is now Grace University in Grand Rapids there, and was going to be a minister. And that didn't work out, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I still ended up graduating, kind of a dual focus on psychology and theology, because it was a Bible college, so I had to, continue taking theology courses. Yeah, came out to Washington, and I've been here ever since, and have never really quite stopped studying religion in particular. But I will say that I will not be making any kind of statements concerning my expertise in Christianity, or really any religion in particular. I will say that there's a lot of sources that we can be found. I love talking about this stuff, and I've been looking at it for 20 plus years. So there's that. And beyond an academic thing, it is very much a personal matter as well, given what I came out of, and as well for probably most of you here. So this is definitely a
yeah, thank you so much, David. So the first thing that we usually open the religion series with is, what's your coming out story of religion? Because most of the speakers that come to RfRx are in fact ex-religious people. So I believe you're not an exception in this case. So if you could just share as much as you're comfortable, what was your coming out story? What was the process behind it and all that jazz?
Sure. So the story is it's just weird. So I'll say one thing right at the beginning. Some people out who are, kind of listening here, who may have deconverted quite a while ago. That's the word that I often use. Is that you often feel like you look in the mirror and go, I am everything that I used to hate, that I used to preach against. It's not as terrible this time, but these days, because it's been, say, I deconverted in 2001, November, to be exact. And there's some story with that, but it's just funny. There are days where you just kind of go, especially when researching for this talk. It was definitely a few things where I'm like, wow, I really used to believe a lot of things and condemn pretty much everything that I now do, which was a little weird. So thankfully I'm a therapist, so I got to talk to myself through it. But I went to a Bible college. I grew up very religious. My family still is. My parents in particular, definitely on the fundamentalist evangelical side. And so grew up like focus on the family. Moody Bible Institute was actually the college that I originally was going to attend, and applied for before going to Grace. And so, the idea of serving the Lord in every way imaginable. This was not just an idea, this was life. No joke. I mean, the quote unquote Bible was seen not just as a nice literature. It wasn't just even as a book to study for the faith. It was the truth of the universe. That's just what it was. So went to college, and I had a history of being, frankly, a pain in the ass, and just asking a lot of questions, and not being very satisfied with simple answers. So, I started studying presuppositional philosophy, apologetics, and other things around the age of 15, 16. I was actually, asked to leave a church because I was too conservative. I didn't fit in my youth group at the time, again, because I was calling out the youth group leaders as not, holding standards. And I wasn't very nice about it either. So yeah, I cringe a little bit in retrospect. So then went off to college thinking, all right, so this is finally going to be a place where I'm going to be surrounded by people who care as much about studying these things as much as I do. No, that was not the case. And in fact, I almost didn't even attend Grace. I attended a weekend thing where you spent like a couple of days in classes and then you left on a Saturday kind of thing. And I was sitting there like, there's no way I'm gonna go away for a year kind of thing. Maybe I'll go into mission work or something, because I'm sitting here and all these students are doing, there was no joke, a death metal Christian dispensationalist rock band that was screaming very loudly. If you can follow all of those words, you get a prize. But yes, that was their thing. And I'm just sitting in the lobby, just going, "This is this is ridiculous." So, but at the time, you know, I ended up meeting a couple of people who ended up being really good friends for many years, and that's what got me there. So pretty much relationships are at the core of the journey. But then kept asking more questions, studying, you know, the theology, starting, you know, a lot more of the history, you know, looking at various theologies and the way systematic theology works. And I started studying science, I know, bad, and got convinced of evolution, which then, of course, really screwed up the KJV only, very literal translation of the Bible that I had gotten into. So that didn't work really well. And finally, I was given a book called Atheism: The Case Against God by George H. Smith, which I still actually recommend. It's a great book. And I was given it first, took a year to study, came back to it, and within like a month, I was like 50 pages into the book. I'm like, I'm out. Like, I'm done. And it just, everything just really, you know, coalesced. But unfortunately, I still had multiple years left of Bible college. And I didn't really think a lot of my credits would transfer. So I ended up staying and kind of playing the role of, you know, skeptical theist kind of thing. I learned later that I really didn't convince any of my professors. They were well aware that I was a heathen, but to their eternal credit, they really didn't make a big deal out of it. They gave me plenty of opportunity to study. They were really dedicated to the academic side of their faith. So as a consequence, I didn't get kicked out. And that was it. So graduated and moved on out to Washington, which I was assured by people at the Bible college that it was a den of lesbian Wiccans. Unfortunately, I got out to Washington, and no, that is not the case. Washington is not filled with lesbian Wiccans. So yeah, there's that, unfortunately.
Well, I didn't know that Washington was supposed to be but it's great to know. I'll note it for when I go to the US. Love to know that.
And
I also,
yes.
yeah, and I also wasn't expecting you to be so conservative that even like the leaders of your church were like, okay, you need to calm down. Like, I'm really curious to know, like, what were you saying for it to be that bad? But
yeah,
obviously you don't need to share it if it's
that was
too bad.
I joke that I was basically, theologically speaking, to the right of like Attila the Hun. I mean, it was, there were, like, James Dobson didn't go far enough for me. Like, it was really, really far right. There was, I think at one point in some of the particular theological circles that I was walking in, maybe 10% of Christians out there actually believe it. I mean, it was just bizarre. but really got into mid-ex dispensationalism, which we can talk about if people really want to. Got into KJV only, which we can definitely talk about as well if people want. So it was really a very, very narrow isolationist thinking, but yeah, kind of crazy.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Thank you for sharing that. So the next question that we usually ask is a very, very brief history of the religion. So I'm sure a lot of people here will be aware of, the history of Christianity, but I am not because I'm incredibly ignorant. So I will still tester David with, tell me a bit about the history, but just very brief because obviously it's, we don't want to have a full-on history lesson, but just to give some context to the current religion.
Well, and I will say that I am not qualified to give an absolutely stellar history. If you really want to, and I know some of the resources I sent to Amaya, so I'm sure those will get shared. But for anybody interested, the story of Christianity by Justo Gonzalez, he has it in 2 volumes. Cannot recommend enough. It really, one, it's fabulously well written. He is a believer, so he makes no bones about it. He doesn't shy away from it. And in some ways, I actually appreciate that better because it shows up in his dedication to his historical academics. Like he really, there are multiple times in reading through those volumes and their volumes, they're like 500 pages a piece, where he says things that make sense to him. And, and as a believer, he already has an answer to it. But as a non-believer reading it, he has to say them because of his dedication to historicity. But then, but it really doesn't help the actual, story as far as an evangelical perspective. So it's just really well done, and it's quite a history. So without getting a whole lot of dates and names and so on, my focus really is about the themes that really the history of Christianity embodied and still does in many ways. And that is one, a kind of peasantry to upper class. So at the time, very beginning, really the people that were being converted were the lowest of the low class, like not intellectuals, not wealthy. These were peasants. These were, the workmen of the time. And in fact, the term Christian was seen as a derogatory term precisely because it was seen as as the faith of the moron. I mean, really, like, it was just like, none of you know what the hell you're talking about. Paganism at the time, at the very beginning, was, and by pagan, we don't mean what we mean now. Paganism at the time was like Greek philosophy. It was Plato, it was Aristotle, it was, all of these big thinkers that had come forward over the last several hundred years. And they're like going, okay, wait a minute. Here are these like massive minds that were trying to fathom the secrets of the universe. And here this new kind of mystery cult comes onto the scene who is filled with, the working class, to use a modern, phrase. And in making it even worse, they were often referred to as atheists because they had no physical God. it was invisible. So the pagans, which are pretty much everybody else, were looking at them going, you're really not believers. Like you don't have a God. This is fake. This is ridiculous. So yeah, it's amazing what 2,000 years will do to you. But a lot of these terms got switched around. And yes, Jeff, how things have changed. Yes, indeed. And so, although I remember a joke, I forget where I heard it from once, but basically all monotheists are just atheists one step removed. So, there is that. But during this whole process, Christianity evolved through a lot of, social unrest and politics, and the way it evolved was very much socially. So it started off, often believers were, looking at themselves and dealing with in groups, meeting in houses. Now, during the persecutions, which were varied, not nearly, and this was actually one of the things that Gonzalez was really good about, is he had to stick with actual historical examples that could be verified as much as possible. So he couldn't declare that there was like 150 years of like absolute devastating persecution and everybody hated Christians. No, it really wasn't. It wasn't, cakewalk, but it wasn't a universal pogrom. It was often regionally done. Often it had more to do with financial disenfranchisement, removing people. Although, yes, there were, not to minimize it, quite a lot of death as well. And that, in fact, played a role a little bit later in different ways. But because of that, they ended up actually meeting in underground cemeteries, in mausoleums, is eventually where they moved from the house and went into secret and were meeting in cemeteries, which really set the stage for, in many ways, social respect. Even a lot of the pagans at this time started, which is everybody else, started looking at Christians and going, you're willing to actually go through all of this, meet in secret, go through all these processes despite this. Like, okay, this is interesting. It was only later that they, developed into churches, much later. This was post-Constantine later, when they were actually looked at as in any way kind of legitimate. And then, of course, during this whole time, there's this notion of theological development. So it's kind of a third theme. And that is, they wanted, to get away from this notion of Christians being stupid and ignorant. And so as a consequence, there started being a lot of the earliest so-called church fathers, like Origen, Tertullian, and others, they were, had come out of law school. They had come out of a lot of the philosophical academies, and they started going, okay, wait a minute. How can we better equip the believers? How can we spread the message to the pagan people better? And part of the way that they thought about doing this is going, okay, wait a minute. Maybe we can start seeing how Christianity fits within the history of philosophy. So rather than being like, contrary to, we started the notion of, wait a minute, this is something that has been long with us for all of time. So, they started the notion, this was actually Origen. He started the idea of, the overarching ideas from Plato being, in fact, God, the idea of forms and all this stuff. And so there was this movement of going, okay, wait a minute. So if this fits, maybe it fits in better. So there was this notion of God being part of the rest of the, gods of paganism. And in fact, when Constantine, so-called, converted, he in fact never stopped giving sacrifices to the pagan gods. Never stopped. He waited, it was all the way until his deathbed before he ever actually even was baptized, and this whole thing. And in fact, some, Gonzalez among others noted that in fact there were some church leaders that during Constantine's time that had to really, call up and call out some Christians because they themselves were giving sacrifices to Constantine as a god. So it was like, wait a minute, no, this doesn't work, guys. This is not, it's not legit. So there was this whole notion of like, how does this all fit together? And so they were constantly struggling with this idea of, okay, we're a people set apart, which was very much taken out of Jewish history. And yet at the same time, as time went on, they become a centerpiece of society and what that comes with it. So Frank, the idea of, the church under Constantine was given, tax, abstention. So they didn't have to pay taxes. They were given a ton of land, which really started throwing in a lot of history later on, having ramifications for what we now look at as the Catholic Church and a lot of the money that they accrued, 1,000 years later. There was a notion of, what do we do now with all this pomp and circumstance? What do we do with the notion of the fact that now that we're the center, in their mind, of the Roman Empire, what does that do with the previous idea of the eventual return or the eventual, bringing about of the kingdom of God, which was taken from Judaism? So instead, they started switching it and saying, well, now that's been fulfilled, and that fulfillment is now in Constantine. We're all good. It's now time for us. So we had this kind of beginning ground of a lot of theological debates that we now kind of, talk about in certain circles, these days. And in fact, as Gonzalez, among others, notes, the whole notion of the end of times thinking, otherwise you looked at as eschatology, really went away for like 1,000 years. Like people just really weren't concerned with how the world ends and how things, developed in that way for quite some time, because they thought really this is it. We're living already in it. The word was eschatology. There you go, spelled it. And so, and of course, during this whole time, you had a lot of, and I'm glossing over a ton. So you had a lot of controversy around theology. You had notions around, the idea of who Jesus was. So you had the Arian controversy as to, whether or not Jesus was actually part of the Trinity. In fact, the notion of the Trinity, the notion of sin, the notion of, the legitimacy of baptism, the idea of original sin or the role of women in church, all of these things weren't established for hundreds of years. You had the Council of Nicaea in 325, which started the idea of, in fact, Nicaea was called to address concern over whether or not Jesus was divine. No joke. Like right up until, in fact, not until 381 at the Council of Constantinople was this question really kind of put to rest for the majority. And so 350 years past, however which way you fall on the historicity of Jesus. But 350 years post the common idea of that he existed, they're still wondering, like, wait a minute, was this guy God? How does this work? And there's a lot of issues around why that was. There was political issues, there was social problems, and all of that. We can get into that more, if people want. But suffice to say, I mean, these debates were something that were from the beginning and still are with us now. In fact, the other main one, which was called Docetism, which had to do with whether or not the church was supposed to be wealthy or whether it was supposed to look more monastic. They were debating it. I mean, so the Catholic Church as we see it, or even the Eastern Orthodox Church as we see it now, really was a debatable point. Like there was a huge, quite a lot of people going, this is not what we're to be about. This is not helpful. In fact, the entire structure of the Catholic Church directly comes out of the fact that they took on the hierarchical structure of the Roman Empire. Like, it's just in the trappings thereof. I mean, so much of this really is that problem, which we're still dealing with today in many ways, of this melding of politics or government and Christianity. And so it's really, the whole thing of it is that at the end of the day, it's that constant struggle of going, okay, so what is the nature of belief? When Christianity was small, for instance, in order to be socially labeled as a believer, you had a 3 years process to go through. So there's just, so 3 years process to going up on, what it would take. And in fact, by the end of the 3 years, that's when you were baptized, which by and large, most people were doing immersion, unless you didn't have, running, a source of water, because not everybody did. But, it's but then of course, as time went on, that was fine. Like if you had a small number of people converting at any given time in any given area, you could ask them to take 3 years of study and personal, evolution to work through all of this. But as soon as you started having from like 5% of the empire to like 90% of the empire, well, suddenly you can't really be asking everybody to spend 3 years and study. So instead, it really evolved from, we're going to ask you to know all this, to simple declarations, which got, opened up a whole other can of worms, because now you've got people, and a whole bunch of questions as to, is it behavior that's important? How important is the declaration? You had a lot of concerns over, here are people that had denied the faith under persecutions. And so, are we allowing them to come back into the fold? Are we not? So all of this, in many ways, reading history is a lot like just reading what's going on. How many times have we heard, well, that's not a real Christian. That's not what real Christians do. This was not a question that is modern. This is a question that's been around since, 300, literally 1700 years and longer. And there's just so much there that we can appreciate, if not find amusing at times. I think the favorite little tidbit, and that'll be it, is that there was, I guess, in the whole notion of whether or not priests and monks should be celibate, which at the very beginning was not a big deal. later on became, a major issue. But so many people were literally like so incensed over removing themselves from the physicality as being sinful that they were castrating themselves. And it became such a big deal that they actually, the church as a whole, had to make a declaration of going, guys, you really need to stop doing this. You're not allowed to keep doing this. In fact, if you do, we're not going to let you become a priest. In which really I think was due to, it's kind of difficult to convert people when you start getting the notion or running around that you have to castrate yourself in order to get into it. So it was a bit of a PR problem, I think, at the time. But yeah, people are funny and really haven't changed much in 2,000 years. So yeah.
Another unexpected thing, the whole, castration bit that I definitely wasn't aware of. But I'm kind of
a little shocked myself.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I feel like religious leaders try to not like share so much, because obviously lots of people will be like, fuck no, I'm not gonna do that for my religion. So yeah, that's good to know, but hopefully it's not practiced anymore, is it? Or maybe it is in like really, really close cults.
You can always find people who do bizarre things in the name of their faith. And by bizarre, of course, is by perspective. It's, you still have people in South America who, to this day, given the fact we have Easter coming up, who participate in live crucifixions. No joke, full on nails through the feet and hands. You have people who are lining up to be the person who does this. It's really stunning. Really, in that kind of zealotry is Philippines too, absolutely. That kind of zealotry is something that the church, and I'm using this very loosely, but the church has dealt with back and forth since its beginning. What is, when they were dealing with the monastic orders, like, wait a minute, are we all supposed to run into the desert and be almost like a stoic ascetic? Like, how does this work? Are we, how are we to preach? Later on, it's, what is the degree of celibacy? How does any of this work? And you always had people who were declaring from a certain majority perspective, an extreme position. And yet from another perspective, they were simply looking at it as, no, we're just following through on the core principles better than you are. Mm-hmm. So, and really outside of certain very serendipitous social changes and political changes, everything that we know of today would just simply not be. Like it just wouldn't be here in the way that we look at it. It's really crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the next question that we usually have is, what are the different sects of the religion? And I think with Christianity, it can be especially challenging because, Christianity has so many different versions, and I feel like each year there is like a new one that comes up that kind of takes over like a bunch of people. And to be completely honest, I'm only like aware of very, very few, very, very basic ones. So obviously we wouldn't be able to cover every single sect that exists within Christianity, because we will have to have like a separate RfRx session for each sect. But just as a brief overview, can you give us like the most common different sects, or the most interesting? Because if there is any that do the whole castration things, I'd love to know, especially to avoid it and to disencourage anyone from joining. But if there is any interesting ones or the main ones that you can talk about.
Basically, there's so many.
But generally, and so like I just mentioned, I'm using the term the church very generally. So there's, of course, the three main, which you could look at as Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox. The history of why Catholic and Eastern Orthodox developed their own path is really, from a historical perspective, fascinating. It really, really interesting how that has gone and why it continues, and why they are different, and why they each have a different power in society, at least during certain periods of time. So Protestantism, itself gets broken down into any number of what referred to as denominations, could also be referred to as sects. I never pronounce that very well because I have a bit of a lisp. So sects. So and so you have everything from the initial groups, Anglicans, Lutherans, which stemmed very much from the initial Protestant revolution, as I affectionately refer to it as, or Protestant rebellion, as it was referred to by some at the time. Which you had, of course, Martin Luther in the kind of almost social mythology of stapling those 95 theses to the wall. Not quite what happened, but it's a nice story. And so you had this breakup, which was basically as close as possible to Catholicism. There was just these few things that really wanted to be changed. And then the floodgates opened up, frankly, with the printing press. Once you started being able to give, in fact, the warning was done at the time that if you, I forget who predominantly said it, but there were multiple, at the time we were stating, like, you give the so-called Bible to the masses, you will have as many groups as there are, believers. And sure enough, you can pretty much do that. And so you have everybody from, Baptists to Anabaptists to Southern Baptists to Grace Gospel Fellowship, and people of varying sizes of groups and so on, all based on various issues of whether or not there should be deacons, whether or not women can serve in the church at all, or whether or not women are okay to serve, but they can't be in positions of leadership. You have issues around the role of baptism. Should you sprinkle? Should you be total immersion? Do you need to baptize at all? You have issues around, you have the Pentecostals. So, the one that is, often, particularly when leaving Christianity, easy to poke fun at. You have the talking in tongues and, the people falling on the floors, which is really a bit of a caricature. So I will throw that out there, but it's not completely false. But you had all this stuff, it's just like, so you have all these groups who from the very beginning tie themselves to particular aspects of what they believe is an interpretive way of looking at the Bible, and then ran with it, and they got enough people together, and now they've got their own denomination. But it's all based on, and here's the question, of course, for, one of the things that got me questioning was, so you have all of these groups die hard telling each other that this is, you're full of it. Nope, you're full of it. Nope, you're wrong. And they're all using the exact same book. Who would have thunk? And then, of course, on top of that, and here's a fun little history thing on that. So the notion of the Trinity, in fact, which, many times, the rejoinder to all of these, debates or is going, well, you have all these people who disagree with each other, is that, but the core doctrines are what we all agree on.
Well, I would think that how one becomes saved is a pretty core doctrine, and not everybody agrees with that. But on the other hand, even the notion of the Trinity really wasn't solidified until 381 in, as I mentioned before, as far as the Council of Constantinople. And in fact, at the Council of Nicaea, so the notion of, the Nicene Creed was developed because they wanted an idea, they wanted to combat Arianism, which was the idea that Jesus as the word, was itself not part of God, was a created entity. Granted, he was created entity prior to all of the rest of the creation, but still a created entity. And to combat that, they came up with the creed, but they came up with it because even at the time they knew that the strength of the argument wasn't strong enough from the Bible itself. So they had to come up with a universalized statement that was logically sound to make their point. So it's like, even from the very beginning, some of these, doctrines that people just absolutely believe are bedrock principles that everybody's always believed, just not true. This was a developed process, fascinating from a sociological perspective, but a developed process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, David. I had absolutely no idea. So I know you spoke about a bit of what do Christians believe in, and for example, the concept of original sin and all of that. But could you develop a bit more on what sort of beliefs distinguish Christianity from other religions? Like, what do Christians believe in, and also how is it organized in sense of I know that in certain versions of Christianity, like the Pope is a very relevant figure, but not so much in others. So if you could explore that a little bit.
Yeah. So, so many things. So the way I tend to frame it is, and in fact, this was a bit instrumental in my own deconversion, because I actually got a little bit into the study of Catholicism for a time, just going, okay, I'm not finding the answers in broad Protestant circles. So maybe you can find it here. Like, they've been around for a long time. They seem to have it. They don't. But it was really interesting getting into. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And if anybody caught my deconversion date, November of 2001, so a couple months after 9/11. So 9/11 happened, and up until then, I've been, had already established a lot of, the science bona fides, had already started in evolution, started questioning literalism, and started going, okay, so here we have a group who is, let's face it, quite dedicated to their particular version of a religion, who are more than willing to die in its name. And the inevitable question came up, particularly for somebody who, in a peak of religious arrogance, thought, oh yeah, I would totally become a martyr for my faith. Of course, it's easy to say when you live in, Western United States in a city where, every third person believes like you do. But you can say it, you can say it proudly. And so, the question then came up, like, okay, wait a minute, what is giving them their fervency? What's giving them their purpose? And started studying Islam a bit more and started going, okay, wait a minute. So most of the arguments that I would use against Islam also apply to Christianity. Well, shoot, that's not helpful. So really, that was another, kind of step down that path. But you have the big three, of course, big three, which I'm going to note right away. I'm saying the big three from a very Western perspective. As far as adherents are concerned in history, Buddhism, Hinduism, and its various sects far outnumber everybody else, and have been along for quite a bit longer. So there's all of that. But even that, you have a difference in. I'm going to try really hard to not get too deep into philosophy here. But you basically have a difference of opinion as to what is the fundamental nature of the universe. And so you have various dualisms that are going on. What is the nature of the spiritual reality or the supernatural? And all of that stems from. Then you have the big three as far as like the middle world to Western civilization of, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. The two stem from Judaism. It just depends on what they do with it. And so it depends on what your holy book is and what your primary leader is. So depending on the religion, of course, is your version of what God is, which was always fun as an atheist for the first few years. Is like, do you believe in God? And I would always or at least often respond with, which one? Like, define first, so we don't just assume that we're all speaking about the same thing. In fact, that was also an issue with the Bible as well. It's like, which one are you talking about? Many of the versions disagree with one another, so that's always fun. But you have, anything from, so what's the fundamental nature of reality? What is the nature of God? What is the nature of salvation? What's the nature of humanity? Is there a notion of eternal, is the physicality evil? And what does that look like? Not everybody has a notion of original sin. So also interesting. In fact, even Catholic Church didn't always have the notion of original sin. So you can imagine, just as a tangent there for a moment, the sheer amount of suffering over the last 2,000 years that could have been avoided by not having that doctrine win out is stunning to me, just as a side note. Yeah. Anyway.
I love what you were saying about, how do you define God and all that stuff. It kind of reminded me a bit of Jordan Peterson, who can like redefine anything to mean anything, and therefore just create the meaning from the ground up, like completely make up everything and just make it make sense in a way, because there is not enough to ground your beliefs in, because the Bible is so inconsistent and there's so many different versions. So, you can come up with completely weird ideas on what it means, to be a believer, what it means, what does God mean? Is it a concept? Is it a real thing, or, a tangible thing? What is it exactly? So yeah, I find that really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And then we would like to know, what are the specific struggles that people in this religion face? Because obviously, each religion comes with its struggles and its problems, but what are the specific ones that you would say are more related to Christianity? And also, how can we help people coming out of Christianity?
Good question. So by and large, I will look at the struggles that are fairly unique to Western civilization. Christianity definitely shows up with different struggles depending on where you are in the world. There are still Christians killing Christians in Africa, India. This is not exactly something that most of us here in the States really have to worry about. I mean, you might not get the brisket at the local church potluck if you don't belong to their group, but you're not going to have your house burned down and your family slaughtered. So yay. That's a win. So this is very much here, and putting it in context as well, as far as, how all of that works, and really, as much of the struggles are that we have here really could be worse. And it's not to ignore the struggles that go on here. It's just, wow, thankfully we have come a long way. But the, here, there's the biggest question, frankly, which has continued from the very beginning. What is women's role? The whole notion of original sin being referred to eventually as Eve's sin is itself one of the most catastrophically horrible ideas that has ever been created, pretty much right alongside the original sin notion itself, but has resulted in a host of sociological ideas about women's inferiority, leadership, the so-called weaker sex ideas, and so on. And 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 as a flip side as well, the what that then means for men is this notion of, in the burdens of what that then means of being head of household, of being looked at as, the very notion of men being the breadwinners likely has some, has at least a variable connection, to this. So you have a whole bunch of social issues that we're still struggling with to literally this day, that is stemming from, how Christianity has been interpreted by and large. As far as deconverting is concerned, man, if you're particularly if you're already in a sexual minority and you're deconverting, I can only tell you help is out there. And there are people in groups that are there to support you. There are far too many teenagers in particular who have been removed from their homes and have no resources because of their identity and in how they look at themselves and who they believe themselves to be, and on the basis of sex and sexual attraction. And it is frankly an atrocity that it continues. So you have those issues, you have threats, you still have issues around people being killed, not per se around whether or not you belong to a particular version of Christianity necessarily, at least here, but certainly, I remember, hearing, there was a sermon, I forget this, I think it was Dobson, may have been, I forget. Anyway, but it was back during, I think it was Clinton's days, in which at the time I was still very much a believer. And he was talking about and alluded to in his nationally broadcast sermon about basically praying for the death of the Supreme Court justices. And he alluded to it, he didn't call out for it because he knew better. But it was obvious. And in fact, it was so obvious that he actually had to stop for a moment and go, that's not really what I'm meaning. And everybody kind of laughed along with him because they knew what he really meant. And on the face of it, it's absurd. Like on the face of it, you just kind of go, really, you're gonna, mind talk to an imaginary being and get him to start killing people. And it's not, it's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that it is a socially acceptable, in some circles, way of mitigating one's desire to commit horrible acts. There are still stories that occur, and not going to get into, all of the, the mental health issues that often probably are involved. But stories of roommates getting murdered by the roommate when they find out that they're an atheist. Families killing their own kids because they heard the voice of God. And things just, thankfully, it's not a normal occurrence. Even most believers these days look at that and go, that is not right. And frankly, that just shows the the absolute power of modern morality, because even people who fundamentally should disagree with its basis can't help but go, actually, this is a pretty good idea. So, but so you deal with threats, you deal with isolation, you deal with a kind of social versions of pogroms. There's also, frankly, just a loss of purpose, depending on how extensive your belief structure was, how pervasive it was for guiding various aspects of your life. It can be devastating, absolutely shattering, to wake up one morning, so to call it, so to speak, and recognize that, wait a minute, the last 30 years of my life has been based on maybe not a lie particularly, but a deception. And worse, that I deceived myself in it. Like, it's not even like, when you're younger, you can almost put it at, well, you can blame my parents, you can blame society or whatever. But as you get older and you leave, there's that, the pressure, the responsibility starts looking at and going, no, I've been doing this to myself for this long. That can be really just, frankly, damning, to use it in a secular word. And there's a power to why then you don't leave. I mean, I know RfR and other organizations are related to the sheer number of pastors and ministers out there who are, yeah, they're not believers anymore. But there's no way they can leave. They've got family, they've got social standing, they've got bills to pay. And so they go about their lives. And I think, when I first deconverted, it means, there's, what's the, there's no greater proselyte than the sinner. Well, let me tell you, there is no greater zealot for atheism than the recently deconverted. And so, it's easy to condemn the people who haven't left. And yet over time, there's an appreciation for the pressures that so many are under for that. Yeah, that gets personal. Anyway, so, but yeah, loss of sense of purpose. The fact that some of these doctrines, this is actually the part I'll end on here, is that, certain doctrines like original sin, one's relationship to one's own sexuality, both in identity and actions, still continue to play a role. You may have left it in a kind of headway, but you have not truly left it in the whole of who you are. And it has been, see, 2001, so almost, it'll be 20 years here in 8 months since leaving. And there are still moments where the notion of sin comes up. There's still, moments in which, death anxiety, what's on the other end of it? Am I going to get to the other side, so-called, and have Jesus going, oops, you screwed up, you're done, welcome to everlasting torment? Still there. Like, it really never quite fully leaves you, again, depending on the degree to which, is, within your life. But yeah, influences.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, David. I've always been quite fascinated by how Christianity have managed to, like, make so many people believe in it, whilst also being so incredibly discrimination. Like, I was going to say a word that doesn't exist, but basically discriminating so many different minorities, pretty much anything that's not a white cis man, essentially, like anything that's not that, and heterosexual, of course, then it's like completely, just not accepted, and you should pretend to be someone else, which is always fun and great for your mental health. So
And that point itself, sorry, that point itself is why, like when you study history, none of the early church fathers and so on were white. I mean, it's just like the history of Christianity is not the history of whiteness. It is the history of an idea that had multiple ideas that was pervasive across multiple cultures and people. One of the most pernicious, and it's not that many people don't try to spread this BS, having recently run into actual white supremacists, not the white supremacists that are, hey, I disagree with you, therefore you are one. But real ones who are like, no, we're the supremacy of the white race, whatever the heck that means. There is much of a denial of history as anybody else is, and the sheer number of cultures and variations in skin color and so on that were involved in the creation of Christianity is stunning. It is absolutely stunning and really should not be ignored. In fact, anytime being able to push back on it is this is just pure revisionism. This is a fantasy that is as much a fantasy as Daniel going up on the chariot of fire. I mean, it just the whole thing is just absurd, and yet it's peddled by way too many people. Anyway, sorry, just that was a recent issue that came up in a conversation a couple weeks ago, and it's just got me all like,
yeah. No, I mean, yeah. Feel free to rant as much as you need. So, a question that I guess isn't necessarily on the I don't know, on the list, but what I'm curious about is what sort of techniques does Christianity use to lure people in? Because I feel like if you're born into Christianity, then fair enough, that's what you know. But if you are a new person, which is being introduced to the religion, what sort of techniques do they use in order to attract new people?
It's interesting looking back through history is that the techniques haven't changed. Most people still get or come across and be converted by normal people. I mean, the vast majority of the initial believers were not being brought over and leaving paganism to varying degrees because of the power of argumentation. It wasn't even the power of necessarily fear or salvation, because those doctrines weren't fully developed right at the beginning. So those came later and has definitely played a role. But initially, it was your Joe Schmo, carpenters and your average person. That's why there was such a push to develop a kind of intelligentsia of Christianity about 200 onward, is because they were looked at as this is a joke of a thinking process or an ideology. And that still largely happens. I mean, most people today adventure are not coming across Plantinga and going, yes, I'm totally enraptured by the philosophical joy of this, writing. No, nobody's coming across J.L. Mackie and going, yes, I understand that ethics are truly impossible without a divine source. It's not. No, most people are, coming up with a civic faith. It's my parents were, my friends are. I had a good time at church camp where you were basically drugged up with sugar cookies and late night fire chats and got up early, so you're pretty much sleep deprived, high on sugar, and bound into a social experiment of teenage horniness, and you go, oh yeah, if Jesus is this, let's go with it. I mean, and it's Bible camps are so much fun. Yes, they were. Um, and, you know, in some of it, it's difficult. Like the cynical part of me looks at a lot of these tactics and goes, this is some kind of deep Machiavellian strategy. No, like most of the time, that's not it. They're just going, how can we, reach people and make things interesting based on this truth that we deeply feel? And you're like, okay, well, how do we go about doing this? Well, let's put together camps and let's put together big experiences and let's tie food and fellowship to it. What do we all want? Relationships. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. We want to belong. And so fundamentally, those are the strategies. And now over the course of history, the strategies have shifted in focus. The idea of, fear, salvation, really at its core is about ostracism, is about being denounced from the community. Ostracism itself has been a time-honored tactic well beyond religious circles to castigate people. So what's the worst thing you could happen in, initial tribal humanity? Well, you get cast from the circle because you're probably going to die. So kind of, they don't even have to kill you. This is just terrible. And Jack, good point in the chat there. Huxley's great on that. So there's, so there are a lot of different tactics. There's deathbed conversions, which, effectively there's the, here's the, wouldn't you rather, like, isn't this great anyway? So even if you're wrong, why is this a problem? Kind of thing. But even then, it all comes down to wanting to feel Pascal's wager. Thank you, Jeff. I can't believe I blank on that. Probably because I haven't used that wager in quite a long time. But it really, all of it is really all about socialization. It's belonging. And so while you might have variations on fear and manipulation and so on, it all really ends up being, coming down to, isn't this great over here? The grass is in fact greener on the other side. So come on over and join us.
Thank you, David. Is there anything else you want to say before we go to the Q&A? Any topic you want to touch on?
I think lastly, we'll look at is when leaving, because it's tricky, is some of the things to help out with is that because so often the conversion tactics are about community, that's one of the first things to find, which is why I love RfR. Just do a plug for you guys, is the fact that this really is about building community. This is about a recognition that we are inherently social creatures, and having left what we believe is the source of our meaning and purpose, here's where we can continue to find a place for our voice to be heard. And so really finding a community. Determine how to find your values and your purpose and meaning outside of Christian structure. Which in fact was the last thing I talked about the last time I was here. But there is quite possible to find an ethic outside of a supernatural religious structure. And which brings into ethics and meta-ethics. How do you think about your well-being? Recently, I've gotten totally hooked on the CBS show Navy SEALs. And because David Boreanaz, awesome, because he's originally Angel and it's awesome. Anyway, nerding out for a moment. But there's a character in it who, his name is Ray. And he, in the second season, he ends up going through this crisis of faith because at a moment he during a battle. He ends up denying the last rites to this drug lord. Complicated. Anyway, and he feels awful about it because here he is. He's basically, in order to get information from him, he denied him his last rites, and then he died before he could go through it. So it's like he's pretty much condemned this man to, damnation, all to serve his country. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is awful. And so this whole thing evolves where he really starts doubting who he is and his morality and who he is as a father and a husband and all this stuff. And you see him devolve into this. And in many ways, it was a testament to the power of faith and the power of religious ideology, because it really was. It was a good portrayal of when you have lost what you believe is the cornerstone and the structure of finding meaning in ethics, to lose it can result in some serious behavioral changes. Now, the fact that generally outside of Hollywood, those changes aren't usually that drastic is a testament to our own kind of internal ethic, but that's another issue. But he found his way, into a new version of who he was as a person by, again, coming back to his own community. And it was, interesting story. And lastly, don't be afraid of finding a new sense of, and I'll use the term spirituality or transcendence. The term is not inherently evil. There are any number of variations on it, and have fun with it to a degree. There is a whole lot of things out there to explore, and it's the not losing sight of mystery, which can still very much be found in science and the study, and how that is a way of looking at the world. Say it's one of the reasons why one of our first books leaving the church is Sagan. But continuing to have that sense of wonder in figuring out where you're going to find it again is really helpful.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, David. I really enjoyed the talk, especially the weird things that different sects do. That's always so fascinating to me. The castration thing is still on my mind. Cannot ignore it at all, but yeah. So yeah, thank you so much. So without further ado, we're going to jump to the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please do write them in the chat, and Madeline and myself will collect them, and then we will ask them to David. So the first question that we have today is the Mormon religion considered mainline Christianity?
Oh, good question. Yes and no. And again, not not expert in Mormonism, but recollection serves. Basically, you have the notion that Jesus appeared again to the indigenous tribes, and he came across those documents and ran with it. Really. So you're like, okay. So there are many, it's in some ways it's almost like you can see a lot of Christianity in Judaism, just like you can see a lot of Judaism in Islam. You can see a lot of Christianity in Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, for that matter. Jehovah's Witnesses are always fun. So they take the 144,000 of true believers that are going to go onward from like Revelation 8 or something. I forget exactly where that's from. And then gloss over the fact that in that same verse that there's 144,000, because it's 12,000 from each of the tribes of Israel, that they were all male and they were all virgins. So, whatever. Still the 144. But yeah, kind of fun. So there is some, I tend to refer not to call Mormonism and others cults, simply because It's a personal thing if you want to, whatever. But I prefer, I usually don't because, they're one person's cults, another person's religion kind of thing. And they're all just trying to figure out meaning based on, frankly, bad principles. So, yeah, it's kind of where you're left.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I remember I was watching this documentary on Netflix about about some bombs in Mormonism. And I remember just being so like confused at the first episode because they said that someone came up with this idea that the founder of Mormonism found a salamander or something like that, and that is what led him to discover, the true documents of the god or whatever. And instead of the salamander, it was something else. It was like he has found it on between some trees, and I was like, how does like both are equally as unbelievable? Like, how is this such a big issue? But obviously, yeah, murder among the Mormons, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in one of my classes back in Bible college days where we came across the Gnostic Gospels and the other stories of Jesus that were around that actually were read for quite a while in church services. But for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, and there's a story that it was like the idea being that Jesus at one point basically took a pie and like birds came out of it or something. And the idea was, well, that's just ridiculous. And of course, one of the students in the class was like, so how is that any more ridiculous than rubbing mud on somebody's eyes and curing blindness? Like, really, where is the line that we're going to draw here? To his credit, the professor was, he's like, I don't know. So it's an honest point there, but yeah.
Oh, bless him. Yeah, Madeline, I'll let you take the second question, if that's okay.
Yeah, so the next one is asking whether Jesus was an Essene like his cousin John, and I did have to look that up, but if you can speak to that, that'd be great.
That is a debate. I will put out my own very, very individual, limited opinion here. So this is not definitive. But the likelihood is that he probably was. Now, part of what's going on is that during the time in which Jesus likely existed, I do tend to gravitate towards the idea that somebody of that name or something probably did exist, was that there were many other people who were going around preaching a coming kingdom. And so trying to figure out who was correct is anybody's guess, and frankly had far more to do with the quality of their social connections. And here's, so came across, I think it's in the resources, but it's called The Myth Maker, Paul and the Origins of Christianity, if I recall correctly. Excuse me. But written by a Jewish scholar that really pointed out that, frankly, if anybody, Paul himself was probably not a Pharisee, but in fact, Jesus probably was. Because the only way for him to have been considered a teacher, which is also why he was probably married, by the way, is that he, had to stand up and in fact show others the quality of his scholarship. And so, and he had to show not only the quality of his scholarship, but he had to show a uniqueness to his own vision, hence where probably, having belonged to at the time, relatively radical, sect of Judaism, like the Essenes were, probably gave him some pretty decent bona fides. Um, as to the truth of it, your guess is as good as mine, and there are probably far better minds than my own that have delved into that.
All right, thank you.
You say that at the same time. Yeah, thank you so much, David. I think that's all the questions today, but that's okay because we are, it's past right now, so that's perfect timing, as if you did it in purpose. But yeah, anyway, that would be the end of the RfRx session, and I just wanted to let you guys know that next week we're gonna have an RfRx session about why we believe in God, or why we believe in God, if there's just one. And we're going to have Andy Thompson doing the session. So if this is something that you're interested in, again, please come next week. That would be amazing. So thank you all so much for coming. And now I'm going to let the amazing, fantastic Dr. Ray take the stand. So Dr. Ray, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amaya. I thank you, David. Every time you come on here, it's a treat. And I'm telling you, you took me back, I'm not going to tell you how many years, to my original sophomore year when I studied the Synoptic Gospels. I didn't even know what the Synoptic Gospels were before I took the course. And I went down a rabbit hole reading the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius, you name it. I read them all. Gigantic books on these shelves in the library. And I'm sitting here thinking, I have never heard of these guys, and I've been a Christian all my life. And I'm wondering, why have they not told me about these? So it was very interesting experiment. So next week, I'm going to tell you, Andy Thompson will be a treat. Andy Thompson actually unofficially edited my book, Sex and God. And I love the guy. And I first met him when he was speaking to 600 people at the American Atheist Convention. And he basically, I watched this guy listen to what I'm going to tell you carefully. I watched this guy get 600 atheists singing Amazing Grace. And that was mind-boggling to me. He was trying to show he was talking about why we believe in gods and using some of the technology and techniques that the religious music has. Anyway, I just want to tell you, show up here next Sunday. I guarantee you will love what Andy's got to say. And I think it was Saint Anselm. Correct me if I'm wrong, David. Wasn't Saint Anselm the one that castrated himself because he fucked the wrong?
I think so. That's part of his myth. As to whether or not it actually happened.
Well, he was told he got a young girl pregnant. He was a priest. It was a Catholic priest. He got a young girl pregnant. The father came and said, "You either marry her or cut your own balls off." Which yeah, we don't know if this is true, but that's the myth. And so, yeah, there was that kind of thing happened back then. Anyway, enough of that. I got to move on or Amaya will kick me out. I hope you all have appreciated and enjoyed what we've done tonight. And please say thank you to David. But just as important, say thank you, if you will, in some way, shape, or form, to Amaya and Madeline they do this every week and they do such a good job and just get such good speakers. Amaya, thank you for all the work you do here. You do not go unappreciated. We love it and appreciate all you do. And know that we're all a volunteer organization here. So if you want to volunteer and help us, we'll find a place for you, like Amaya said earlier. And we survive on donations. So if you can give us a few bucks, we'd appreciate it if you would, just get on there and give us $10 a month or whatever you can spare so we can keep this operation going. Thank you. Thank you, Amaya.